The night air was cool, and a light drizzle fell over downtown Chicago as Gus Lamont, 34-year-old graphic designer, stepped out of a popular bar after a long day at work. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, honking cars, people laughing, the distant hum of the train passing through the loop. Gus had finished his final drink, said his goodbyes to a few friends, and stepped into the night, his footsteps echoing as he made his way down the crowded sidewalk. What happened next is still unclear. By morning, Gus was nowhere to be found. His phone, wallet, and keys were left at his apartment, but he was gone. No messages, no calls, and no signs of a struggle. His friends and family knew something wasn't right the moment they realized Gus wasn't just late. He had vanished. The investigation began with the usual steps. The police checked his apartment, searched the nearby streets, and tried to trace his phone. Nothing. His social media accounts remained untouched, with no new posts, messages, or signs of distress. It seemed as though Gus had disappeared into thin air. But then, a crucial clue emerged. Hours after Gus's disappearance, a witness came forward, claiming to have seen him arguing with an unknown man outside a downtown convenience store just before he vanished. The witness described the man as unremarkable, with a nondescript jacket and a hat. It's making it almost impossible for authorities to gather further information. Despite this fleeting lead, there was little evidence to suggest that Gus had simply walked away. His family feared the worst, that something far darker was at play. Could Gus Lamont have been abducted? The search intensified, with Chicago's finest diving deeper into the case. But what they discovered next would raise even more questions, pushing the investigation into a new and chilling direction. 3 days into the investigation, a breakthrough came, though it wasn't the answer anyone had hoped for. Police received a call from a local park ranger about a car parked on the outskirts of the city, abandoned and running, with the engine still warm. It was an unremarkable mid-sized sedan, covered in a layer of dust. But inside, the discovery would change everything. Inside the car was Gus's phone. It sat on the passenger seat. Unlocked, with his text messages still open. An odd clue, but not an immediate cause for alarm. More disturbing was the distinct scent of gasoline that lingered around the vehicle. Didn't make sense. If Gus had been abducted, why leave his car so far from his apartment, and why leave his phone behind in such a peculiar place? What made the situation even stranger were the marks on the ground surrounding the vehicle. Police forensic experts noticed what appeared to be faint tire tracks leading away from the car, but they abruptly stopped. Almost as if the car had been dropped off by another vehicle, leaving no trace of where it had come from. But there was more. A small scrap of fabric was found snagged on the driver's side door handle, dark blue, almost like a work jacket. This, combined with the peculiar scent of gasoline, seemed to suggest Gus had been in a hurry, or worse, forced to leave in a rush. But the most unnerving discovery was the single fingerprint found on the car's rear window, one that didn't belong to Gus. As forensic teams worked tirelessly to process the car for additional clues, police began to consider a disturbing possibility. Gus hadn't simply walked away, nor had he been lost in a random accident. Someone had been involved in his disappearance, and they had been careful to cover their tracks. It was as if someone had planned to take Gus, knowing exactly where to leave the car to send a specific message. With each new clue, the suspicion grew. Gus Lamont had been abducted, and whoever took him was now deliberately leading investigators down a winding path. The question was, who was the shadowy figure behind the scenes, and what was their motive? 2 days later, as the investigation into Gus Lamont's disappearance intensified, a chilling new detail surfaced. Gus's family had received a phone call, but it wasn't from him. The call came at 2:30 in the afternoon from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was deep, distorted, and robotic, almost as if it was being filtered through a machine to obscure its identity. The voice spoke calmly, yet the message was clear and unsettling. Your son is fine, but he won't be for long. If you want him back, tell the police to stop looking for him. Do not go to the media. This is not a negotiation. You have 48 hours. Gus's mother, Maria Lamont, stood frozen in shock as the words echoed in her mind. She could barely comprehend the threat. Her son had been missing for almost a week, and now someone was telling her to halt the search if they wanted him alive. Her heart raced with fear, but her instincts pushed her to contact the police immediately. The detectives were quick to act. They traced the phone number, but it led to a dead end. The call had been routed through several proxy numbers, making it impossible to track down the caller's true location. The distorted voice was just as elusive as the man seen arguing with Gus outside the convenience store. But there was something else. Maria remembered something Gus had mentioned to her a few months before he disappeared. He had been working on a freelance project, designing a logo for a new startup company. Gus had never been one to talk much about his work, but he'd hinted that this project was particularly sensitive. Could his work somehow be linked to his abduction? Detectives followed up on this lead, contacting the startup company Gus had worked with. The company claimed they had no idea why Gus would have been targeted, insisting that their business was entirely legitimate. But one thing stood out to them. Gus had stopped working with them abruptly, just days before his disappearance. No one knew why, and no one could get in touch with him. They had simply let him go, and since then, they'd heard nothing from him. The call was more than a mere threat. It was a calculated move. Whoever had taken Gus was watching his family, listening to their every move, and setting the terms of the investigation. The abductor wasn't just hiding in the shadows. They were orchestrating a deadly game, controlling the pace of the search, and daring the police to go further. In the wake of the threatening phone call, police began to dive deeper into Gus's last known whereabouts, focusing their efforts on surveillance footage from nearby businesses. After reviewing hours of footage from the convenience store, a new lead emerged, but it raised more questions than answers. The footage showed Gus leaving the store at 22:20 on the night he vanished. But it also captured something far more unsettling. Just moments before Gus stepped into view, a white van had pulled up to the curb near the entrance. The vehicle was parked strategically, as though waiting for someone. Gus briefly glanced in the direction of the van before walking out into the street. Then something happened that wasn't immediately visible on the footage. Gus's figure was obscured by the van as it suddenly drove off, without any sign of struggle or confrontation. At first, detectives dismissed this as nothing more than coincidence. But something gnawed at them. The van's sudden departure, coupled with Gus's brief hesitation before walking away, didn't sit right. Why had Gus stopped in his tracks? Had he seen someone he knew, or had he been forced into the van? After further analysis, it was determined that the van had been equipped with tinted windows, making it impossible for anyone to get a clear view of the interior. And it was too clean, no markings, no company logos, just a plain white van with no distinguishing features. This raised the suspicion that the van wasn't a random occurrence, but a key part of the abduction. However, as the investigation continued, a new twist in the case came from an unexpected source. A local homeless man who had been staying near the convenience store came forward, claiming to have witnessed something the night Gus disappeared. His statement was crucial. He had seen a person leave the van that night, but his description was vague. I didn't see much, just that someone got out of the van. A tall guy, maybe in his late 30s, looked like he knew Gus. He didn't struggle or scream, just got in the van like it was normal, the witness recalled, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. The man had been too far from the scene to offer much more than that, but his testimony added weight to the theory that Gus had known his abductor. Gus had walked out of the store and willingly approached the van, as though he was meeting someone he trusted. It painted a troubling picture. Gus Lamont had been taken by someone close to him, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate him into getting into that van. With this new lead, detectives knew they had to shift their focus. The investigation was no longer about a random abduction. It was personal. Someone close to Gus had orchestrated this disappearance. But who? As detectives dug deeper into Gus's past, they uncovered a troubling connection that no one had expected. Gus had been involved in a short but intense personal relationship just a few months before his disappearance. His ex-girlfriend, Lila Greer, a local journalist, had been one of the last people to see him before his strange exit from the bar. Initially, she was ruled out as a suspect. Her alibi solid, and no apparent motive to harm Gus. But her presence in his life before he went missing turned out to be a crucial detail that had been overlooked. Lila had reached out to the police earlier in the investigation, offering what seemed like well-meaning advice. She had mentioned that Gus had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. But her statement was dismissed as mere speculation. Now, however, her actions, or rather her silence, began to seem more suspicious. Detectives found that Lila had been in touch with Gus the night before he vanished, but the text messages they exchanged were odd. Gus had sent Lila a cryptic message saying, "I think someone's following me." It was followed by another text that simply read, "They know about us." While Lila initially claimed she thought Gus was just paranoid due to stress at work. Her reaction to the news of his disappearance was notably detached. She never once posted about Gus's disappearance on social media, nor did she contact his family, despite their close past. Instead, Lila went on with her life as if nothing had happened, continuing her work as a journalist. Though some of her recent articles had focused on exposing corporate corruption in the very startup Gus had worked with, it wasn't long before detectives discovered Lila had a history with one of the higher-ups at Gus's former company. The man, Jonathan Reed, was known for his shady business dealings, though nothing had ever been proven. Lila had worked with him for years before breaking off their professional ties. Was there a deeper connection between them that Gus had unknowingly stumbled upon? Had Gus's disappearance been tied to something bigger? The more detectives learned about Lila and her tangled connections, the more they began to see a possible link between her, Gus, and the corporate world. If Gus had uncovered something he shouldn't have, it would explain why he'd gone into hiding, and perhaps why someone wanted him silenced. This revelation didn't provide all the answers, but it shifted the focus of the investigation. Gus's disappearance was no longer just a random act of violence or a simple case of abduction. It seemed increasingly likely that Gus had uncovered a dangerous secret, one that people with far more to lose were willing to do anything to keep hidden. Lila's involvement now couldn't be ignored. She was no longer just a concerned ex-girlfriend. She was a key player in a tangled web of deception. The next steps were critical. If Gus had been caught in a conspiracy, someone close to him had to have known. But who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? The investigation had reached a crucial point. Every lead seemed to open new doors, but none of them led to Gus. The clock was ticking, and the pressure mounted. Detective Sarah Linwood, the lead investigator on the case, sat at her desk, poring over the pile of evidence that had accumulated. She had revisited every witness statement, re-interviewed every friend and family member, scrutinized every single piece of surveillance footage. Then late one evening, a breakthrough arrived, unexpected and eerie. One of the officers working in the forensics department called in with a discovery that left Detective Linwood speechless. While reviewing the phone data retrieved from Gus's phone, the officer had come across something unusual. Among the seemingly random contacts and text messages was an encrypted file that Gus had stored on his phone. It wasn't a typical document. Instead, it appeared to be a video file, one that Gus had recorded just before his disappearance. The video was brief, no more than 30 seconds long. It was filmed in a dimly lit room, and Gus's face appeared tired, his eyes red-rimmed as though he hadn't slept for days. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice trembling with fear. "I know this might be the last time I'm able to speak to anyone. I've uncovered something that's bigger than me. It's tied to the company. There are people in power who will stop at nothing to protect their interests, and I'm afraid I know too much. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Someone ... Someone will make sure of that." The video ended abruptly, as if Gus had been interrupted. The footage cut off mid-sentence, and the screen went black. It was clear that Gus had been trying to send a message, but had been stopped before he could finish. The video was the final piece of the puzzle. It confirmed everything Detective Linwood had feared. Gus wasn't just a random victim. He'd been targeted because he knew too much. The conspiracy, whatever it was, had reached far beyond a simple corporate scandal. Gus had been taken to silence him, to make sure he wouldn't expose the truth. But the real question now was, who was behind it? Who had the power to orchestrate such a well-planned abduction and control every detail of the investigation? And, perhaps most importantly, was Gus still alive? Detective Linwood knew the time for quiet investigation was over. They had reached the tipping point. The case had become a race against time, and she could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on her. It was no longer just about finding Gus. It was about stopping those responsible before they could harm anyone else. As the investigation reached its final stage, one thing was clear. The person behind Gus Lamont's abduction was someone with incredible power. Someone who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But who were they? And how far were they willing to go to protect their interests?